failure of nerve, failure of heart. These are the temptations that you and I will walk into when the momentum's against us, when dominant personalities accuse us, when we don't know what to do, when the people drive us crazy, when Jesus is disappointing, when the world looks good. What will we do? Failure of nerve and failure of heart. Well, in thinking about how to deal with this, how do I not give up? And how do I not give in? Like, what's going to keep me rooted? And the thing we have to ask is, like, how did Jesus avoid these things? How did Jesus remain faithful? What can he tell us about this? Well, I think the key to dealing with these two issues is the idea of differentiation. And differentiation is, for the most part, just sort of like a psychological term. It's about a secure sense of self. It's the ability to stand apart without the need of affirmation or the guarantee of outcomes. This means there's something happening within us that gives us the capacity to get through it without the need for fanfare and without the need for results. Now, whenever you talk about differentiation, I think it's important to just note that there's different ways to differentiate in the church in this moment. So it's possible to have sort of a selfish differentiation, which means I can separate myself from the problems of people and the challenges of the culture because I've got a personal agenda. And you just take your ambition that you had in the world and you patch it inside the church. And you use the people of God to further your own kingdom. And so there's a way to be selfish about it where, yeah, you don't give in to the anxiety of the group and you try and be faithful because you want it all for you. And that pollutes Christian community. Paul warns against this in Philippians 2. We read against this in James chapter 3. But there's something worse than that we've seen of late, which gives us tremendous pause, and that's psychopathic differentiation. And this is when people get in positions of power and they literally have no emotional connection with the people they're called to love, and they do violence against them, coercion against them. And this sort of psychopathic differentiation where the Christian community exists merely as a commodity for my agenda, and I just don't care who I hurt or what they think. In this vision, there's no weaker brother or strong brother, there's just me. We don't want this. And I want to tell you, we have to be careful because there's a lot of people doing that right now as a coping mechanism trying to get through. What we need is godly differentiation. Godly differentiation is what we see in Jesus. Jesus was rooted. Jesus had tremendous courage and tremendous compassion. And so he didn't need the affirmation of people, yet he still loved them unfailingly because of how rooted he was with his Father. Godly differentiation. What are the keys to godly differentiation? The first one is a sense of rooted identity. Rooted identity. Now, Christians talk about identity. If there's a women's Bible study in the church, it's going to be an identity Bible study. If there's a men's Bible study, they're going to be completely confused about what identity actually is. The world talks about identity politics, LGBTQ identity, political identity. The reason we're all talking about it is because we're looking for something to root ourselves in, to give us a stable sense of self. And cultural identities are fragile at best, whereas Foucault says they're performative. You've got to live up to them to maintain them, and then they're exhausting. And what we want is that rooted identity. This is what Jesus had. And this is where you will be challenged. And this is why the deep work is really understanding what has happened to you when you became a Christian. In Matthew chapter 3, Jesus is affirmed by the Father. This is my beloved Son who I love, and him I'm well pleased. And then while his hair is still wet from the baptism, basically, he heads into the wilderness, and Satan's first assault is, if you really are the Son of God. The first thing he goes after is his identity. Because if he can get Jesus to doubt who the Father says he is, then he'll give into these temptations of efficiency. So this is one of those things where we have to learn to be rooted in who the Father says we are. When people say to me, like, what are some of the things you do in the morning? One of the weird things I do biblical affirmations about who I am. Now, these are not like Tony Robbins affirmations, you know what I mean? These are not like Joel Osteen affirmations. These are like straight up, in him I am. Wanted, chosen, loved, forgiven, seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. In him I have victory over sin, Satan, death, and hell because I'm united with God. I got to keep telling myself who I am because I'm amazed how quickly, the second I get onto a street in New York City, that thing will be confronted. So it's amazing how often Jesus would retreat to the Father. And in almost every encounter when we get a glimpse, think about this, in almost every encounter when we get a glimpse of what Jesus is doing in private, there is an affirmation where the Father speaks out. And he says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. We need to get that as the truest part of who we are. And we have to do our identity resistance. You remember identity resistance from James Clear's book? It's a smoker who's trying to quit and someone offers them a smoke. Do you want to smoke, mate? Oh, I'm trying to quit. I shouldn't. As opposed to, do you want to smoke, mate? No, I'm not a smoker. I'm good. Every day, the biggest struggle in a person's life, a certain kind of person's life, is to walk past a bank without robbing it. Now, I've never, ever once thought about robbing a bank. Do you want to know why? I'm not a bank robber. Not a bank robber. That's not who I am. It's not what I do. And so often ours like, well, I know the world's good. Rather than like, I'm not worldly. It's identity resistance. And this is what Jesus did. It wasn't, I wish I could, but I can't. It's like, I don't want it because that's not who I am. Rooted identity. Secondly, we've got to have a sense of that upward call. It's the definition of who the audience is. We've got to realize that the only thing that really matters at the end of the day is that you're faithful to what God has called you to do. That's it. Jesus' life, let's just be honest, Jesus' life was not that spectacular in the history of Rome. There's not like a ton of extra biblical historical proofs that he was who he said he was. There's enough to believe, but it's not like Jesus then moved after his resurrection and took on Caesar and got into the middle of the amphitheaters and said, behold, I'm back from the dead, repent, I'm Lord. Caesar's just faking. It's not what happened. But he was faithful to what the Father had for him. He entrusted the outcomes of his life with the call of faithfulness. And he had this Kaizen non-defensive spirit, which means he was just committed to just receiving feedback without being threatened by feedback. And this is what the Japanese have. This is one of their distinctives that enabled them after World War II to rise back to a global power, with production in particular, is because they just said, we will always get better without being defensive. So often Christians is defensive, when there's a lot of truth to the criticism. And so our differentiation has to include feedback so we can follow Jesus more skillfully and faithfully. And then lastly, it's about a vision of faithfulness. Look, brothers and sisters, here's the truth. You're going to get a one-on-one with Jesus. And he's just going to say to you, look, I love you and I gave you these gifts. I gave you your personality. I put you with this time of history. And what I wanted from you was that you would live for me and love me and be faithful to my mission in the time of history I put you. And really, that's the only meeting that matters. And so Paul says, knowing the fear of the Lord and the guardrails of the fear of God and the love of God, that keep us in that path with our eyes on Jesus. I think Jesus was consciously aware of returning to his Father. And we need that sense of eternity to govern what we do. So the failure of nerve is going to come at us. And the temptation to give our hearts away or to give in is going to come at us. But if we're differentiated like Jesus was, rooted in our identity in him, taking feedback to get better, always saying we just want to be faithful to that day we stand before Jesus, we will be those people who are faithful to the end, like Jesus said.